In the spring of 1869, in a dust-choked outpost along the Oregon Trail, a lonely lumberjack paid $2 for a woman whose face no one had seen. The air was thick with the scent of dry timber, horse sweat, and cheap tobacco. Around a makeshift auction platform, little more than planks nailed atop wagon crates, men gathered with rough hands, hollow eyes, and hungers deeper than they could name. Decency did not linger in places like this. A man wearing a faded blue vest and a rusted deputy badge slammed a wooden gavel down and called out, "Last one for the day." He gestured toward the woman standing barefoot on the platform, her figure wrapped in silence and dust. She ain't got no name, ain't shown her face. Sack's been over her head since Missouri. Says she can work. Says she'll obey. Starting bid, $2. Who's brave or drunk enough to marry a mystery? Laughter cracked across the crowd like a whip. One man shouted that she might be a witch under that sack. Another joked she could be dead. A third muttered they might as well marry the sack itself. Some men spit into the dirt and turned away, but others stayed, eyes glittering with cruelty or curiosity. The woman stood motionless, hands bound in front of her with frayed twine. The sackcloth was too large, stained, and pulled tight around her neck. Only the shallow, quick rhythm of her breathing betrayed the fear she tried to hide. Her fingers twitched, clenched, then released. The auctioneer growled, "She's no good to anyone if she won't even speak." No one stepped forward. A long, tense moment passed. Then, without a word, the crowd parted. From the back emerged a tall figure, shoulders broad beneath a worn canvas coat. A black hat shaded his face, and an axe handle, wrapped in weathered leather, hung over his back. His boots were thick with trail mud, his shirt damp with sweat. This was a man who had lived more among trees than people. He raised his voice just enough to be heard. $2. The words landed like stone. The auctioneer squinted. "You sure, mister?" The reply came steady and low. "I said what I said." No excitement, no hesitation, only certainty. A few men snickered. "Must be desperate," someone muttered. The auctioneer, now visibly uneasy, warned, "You don't want to see what you're buying." The man's head tilted slightly toward the veiled figure on the stage. "I ain't buying a face," he said, voice soft as smoke. "I'm marrying a person." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind held its breath. The auctioneer mumbled under his breath, "Name." The reply came, "Silas Boone. Profession, lumberman. Northridge." The official scribbled quickly, "Let it be known that Mr. Silas Boone, resident of Oregon Territory, has entered lawful marital contract under the eyes of God and the witness of this court." Silas signed the paper, without flinching. The judge turned to the woman. "You're now legally wed, miss. Say your name for the record." The sack shifted slightly. No sound came at first. Then, so softly one had to lean forward to hear, a voice emerged. Annabelle Crow. Silas froze. His eyes widened briefly. Just a flicker, then hardened again as the sound echoed in his memory. That voice, he had heard it before, though not the name. A winter night, 3 years past. Blood on snow. Firelight in a frozen cave. A silence that had never left him. Slowly, he stepped off the platform and reached for the woman's arm. Not roughly, not with urgency, but with enough steadiness to say, without words, "You're safe now." No one stopped him. Not a soul in the crowd spoke as the two walked away. Only the creak of boots on wood, and the faint tremble of a name hanging between them like a ghost. Annabelle Crow. The forest seemed to close around them as they moved away from the outpost, the trail narrowing to a single thread of packed dirt and broken pine needles. Light dimmed beneath the canopy. The sun, uncertain, filtered through the thick branches as if afraid to intrude. Annabelle said nothing. The sackcloth still covered her face, tightened around her neck. When the breeze tugged at it, she quickly adjusted it, keeping her face hidden. Silas walked several paces ahead, leading the old mule burdened with the few supplies they had been allowed. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. Occasionally, his eyes wandered to the trees, not for threat, but for something older, something half-remembered. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was a silence of survivors. the kind shaped by different kinds of pain. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had begun to settle. The small shelter was built from dark pine, weather-worn but strong, pressed into a gentle rise of earth that blocked the worst of the northern wind. A stone chimney leaned slightly to one side, and a rusted horseshoe hung nailed above the doorway. Silas pushed the door open with a creak and stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said. "No one's going to place you anymore." Annabelle stepped inside with quiet care. She didn't remove the sack. Her movements were cautious but not broken. Instead of sitting, she crouched in the corner, back to the wall, hands resting on her knees. Silas entered after her, dropped a bundle of firewood near the hearth, and turned to the stove without comment. No questions, no instructions, just the slow rhythm of a man working, as if he'd done it 100 times. The scent of spice and smoke filled the room. Cinnamon, salt, a hint of meat, and warmth began to gather like breath in the walls. When the food was ready, Silas set a wooden bowl on the floor near her. She flinched slightly, but didn't turn. He sat at the table with his own bowl and ate in silence. After a long while, her voice emerged from beneath the sack, muffled but clear enough to hear. "What is this?" Silas stirred the contents of his bowl. "I call it the meal for the last one standing," he said. Then after a moment, he added, "Used to make it for myself after long days in the woods. Then I started making 2 bowls, even when no one else was there to eat the second." She turned her head slightly, peeking just beneath the edge of the sack. On the table beside him sat the second bowl, full, steaming untouched. No one else in the room. Silas saw her glance and continued, his voice low. "I used to set it for my wife. After the war, after the trees took more than they gave. Just a way to remind myself I made it back alive." He paused. "Now I set it for her, and for you." The silence held. The fire crackled gently. Annabelle reached forward, her hands trembling just faintly. She took the bowl, slipped the spoon under the sack, and began to eat, slowly, carefully, every motion deliberate. She said nothing more, but she finished it all. That night, while Silas washed the bowls in a tin basin beside the stove, the fire casting soft light across the cabin walls, Annabelle remained in her corner, her knees drawn up, arms wrapped tightly around them. She did not speak, did not move much, but for the first time since he'd met her, the shaking had stopped. The stillness between them was not tension now, but something quieter, something beginning, after the fire burned down to a steady, ember glow, and the last traces of supper had been cleaned from their bowls. Silas sat alone before the hearth. He hadn't lit the lantern. He didn't need to. The glow from the coals was enough to send long shadows dancing gently along the log walls like faded memories returning. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, long, low, and familiar, its voice like an old friend calling from the dark. Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, letting the warmth brush against his face. But it wasn't warmth he truly felt. Not only that, where no trail ran, where no help would come, the snow began to cover his back, and when he realized no one would find him, he stopped struggling. Then hands, rough, calloused, pulling, dragging. He remembered the pain of movement, the jarring tumble of his body over ice and stone, and then only blackness. His mind drifted backward. 3 years, to a winter crueler than any before. Snow had fallen thick, dense, the kind that turned pine needles to glass and every breath into fire. He'd gone too far north in search of timber, driven by stubborn pride and hunger for wood. On a hidden slope, his boot slipped, his leg twisted sharply beneath him, and he plunged into a snowbank. When he awoke, he was not dead. A fire crackled near his side in a small cave concealed behind a curtain of hanging ice. The air was bitter with the scent of boiled bark and pine. Across from him sat a woman, her face hidden beneath a sackcloth tied carefully, just like the one now resting across the cabin. She was wrapped in scavenged wool and stitched leather, boots patched from scraps. Her hands moved with patient precision as she ladled steaming liquid into a tin cup. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and worn, not high, not low, simply tired and certain. "You don't need to know who I am," she'd said, "but I'm not going to let you die." He tried to speak, but found no words. "Drink this," she continued, offering the cup. "It's pine bark and dry lichen. It'll help the fever." He remembered the taste. Bitter, earthy. He drank. She wrapped his leg, set it by hot stones, fed the fire through the night. He drifted in and out, clutched by cold, by pain, and by something deeper, dreams that tried to take him. When dawn finally came, pale and sharp, she was gone. The fire was still burning, low and tended. Beside it, folded neatly, lay a piece of cloth, embroidered with crooked purple flowers. No note, no goodbye, just that. He had kept it with him ever since, folded into the lining of his coat pocket, like a secret. Now, in the quiet cabin behind him, a woman sat again with the same sack over her face, the same voice, the same stillness, and now a name, Annabelle Crow. He closed his eyes, let the fire warm the front of his shirt, but it wasn't heat he sought. It was memory. He didn't need proof. He had felt it the moment she had spoken at the auction. Not the name, not the words, but the sound, the cadence, the quiet certainty. The woman who had saved him all those years ago hadn't wanted to be known, hadn't wanted to be seen. And now here she was again, still hidden, still unknown to the world, but not to him. Not anymore. He didn't tell her that night. He let the knowledge live inside him, a quiet thread connecting past and present. He glanced over his shoulder to where she sat, still tucked against the far wall, her back turned, her face hidden beneath the sack. The same fear lived in her posture, the same instinct to disappear. But this time, he thought, she was not alone, and that, maybe, was the beginning of something that might survive beyond the snow. The next morning, the forest held its breath. Mist clung low to the roots of the trees, curling and threading like secrets reluctant to rise. A soft wind moved through the needles above, high and careful, as though even it didn't wish to disturb the stillness. Annabelle stepped out of the cabin alone. Her movements were slow, measured. She held her arms wrapped across her middle, but her gait was steadier. The sack still covered her head, but her steps no longer faltered. Her spine was straight, not with pride, but no longer curled in fear. She crossed the clearing to a tall pine that stood like a sentinel at the forest's edge. There, beneath its wide boughs, she lowered herself to the ground and turned her head just enough to face the early morning light. The sun filtered through the branches in soft shafts, and for the first time, she did not flinch from its touch. She reached up with trembling fingers and, for the first time, loosened the knot behind her neck. The sack slid back, inch by inch, until her face was partly open to the wind. Her mouth, her nose, the soft line of one cheek exposed to the morning air. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a declaration. It was simply a beginning. Across the yard, Silas saw her from where he knelt beside a wooden basin, oiling the jagged teeth of the saw. He didn't stand. He didn't call out. His hands kept moving over the blade, slow and sure. But after a moment, his voice carried, low, steady and rough, as if he were saying it more to the trees than to her. "I once got hurt real bad," he said. "Deep winter near Black Ridge. Got turned around in the snow. Should have died out there." The cloth in his hand swept along the steel teeth with quiet rhythm. "But someone found me, pulled me into a cave, saved my life." Annabelle didn't turn. She said nothing, but her body was listening. He continued, voice calm, deliberate. She wore a sack on her head. Wouldn't give her name. Hardly let me see her hands. But I remember her voice. He turned his head just slightly, enough for the words to travel, but not enough to force a gaze. "Your voice sounds just like hers." A stillness followed. Then came the faint rustle of fabric brushing against skin. He didn't look, not even when he felt her eyes settle on him. He only glanced up when the silence deepened, when it demanded to be seen. And there she was. The sack rested in her lap. Her face was bare. It was not twisted, not monstrous, but it bore a mark, a long, curved scar that ran from her right temple to just above her jawline. Not fresh, not bleeding, but unmistakable, as though someone's fingers had tried to claw something from her, something that wouldn't come loose. She met his gaze, not with pride, but with something harder to hold, honesty. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain at first. Then, quietly, almost like confessing to the wind, she spoke. The man who ran the boarding house where I worked, he said I could keep a room if I gave extra. Her voice caught on the word. I said no. He didn't like that. She paused, looked down, gathered herself, then met his eyes again. He came at me. I pushed him. He slipped. His head hit the stove. He died. She stared past Silas, into a memory that refused to fade. I ran. Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She went on, steady now, as though telling the truth was the only way forward. They said I did it on purpose. Said I lured him. Said I planned it all. Her hands opened slightly in her lap, palms up as if offering invisible proof. No one believed me. There were no witnesses. They called me a liar, a temptress, a killer. Silas stood slowly, wiping the oil from his hand with a rag, eyes never leaving her. They sold me off to pay his debts, she said. Passed me from hand to hand like cattle. Covered my face to make it easier, to make me nothing. Her eyes flicked down to the sack in her lap. I wore this so people wouldn't look at me like poison, so they wouldn't see the scar and decide what I was worth before I even opened my mouth. She looked up again, her gaze sharp with the strength of someone who has nothing left to lose. I didn't ask to be saved. I didn't ask to be bought, but I'm tired of hiding. Silas didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. He only nodded slowly once. Thank you, he said. His voice was warm and steady, a man's voice softened by firelight and truth. You didn't have to tell me, but you did. Annabelle blinked hard, but no tears came. Only breath, steady and open. And in that breath, something changed. She was no longer a shadow pressed into the cabin's edge, no longer a shape with a covered face. She was a woman now with a name, a story, and a scar, and Silas had seen them all, and turned away from none. The next morning, sunlight moved through the forest slowly, like it too had softened, gold and tentative. It spilled to the narrow window above the table, casting long beams across the wooden walls. Dust motes spun in the light, like tiny spirits dancing between shadows. Inside the cabin, the air was still, not with fear but with understanding. The kind of stillness that follows after something fragile is shared and gently held. Annabelle had barely spoken since the day before, but she had not reached for the sack. She no longer pulled it over her head before sleep, no longer folded it at the foot of her bed like armor waiting to be worn. When she rose from the cot, her hair was loose, tangled from sleep, resting against her shoulders like threads of quiet freedom. Her movements were careful, her body still guarded. But something in her presence had shifted, something small, like the slow thawing of earth beneath snow. The forest, watching, did not speak, but it seemed to know. It seemed to wait. She blinked against the light that poured through the window, warm and golden, stretching long across the worn floorboards. Drawn forward by habit, she moved toward the table, expecting the usual. The tin canister filled with bitter coffee grounds, the wooden bowl she washed each night before bed, and the bent-handled spoon that never quite dried. These small constants had become her morning ritual, anchors in the quiet. But today, something unfamiliar waited for her. She stopped mid-step, eyes catching on it. There, on the table where nothing ever changed, stood a small mirror. The mirror was upright, framed in silver dulled at the corners by time, but its glass remained clear, polished to a brightness that held rather than scattered the morning sun. It leaned against a block of smooth pine, perfectly angled to gather the light, not in a harsh glare, but in a soft illumination. Next to it lay a scarf, sea green silk, gently faded in places, its fabric folded with care. There was no note, no explanation, no gesture to call attention to their presence. Yet they rested on the table as if they had always belonged there, as if they had simply been waiting for her to find them. Annabelle stared at the items in silence. She did not reach for them. Not yet. The fire in the stove had burned low, giving off only the occasional pop of pine resin. Overhead, the wooden beams creaked softly with the shift of morning air. Outside, the world stirred awake, the sharp call of a jaybird echoing from the trees, dew tapping from the eaves like a slow clock. And still, She stood there, unmoving, held by a tension she couldn't name. When she finally stepped forward, it was with quiet caution, as if afraid the mirror might show her something too true to bear. She reached it and looked. The face reflected in the silver was not new to her. She had memorized it in darkness, in stolen glances and careful touch. Her fingers had traced a jagged scar along her cheek 1,000 times. It was not a mystery. It had become a part of her, as known as the shape of her hand or the rhythm of her breath. But seeing it now, in clean light and stillness, was different. She lifted her hand and touched the mark, gently, the way someone might trace a name carved into stone. Not out of shame, but acknowledgement. The scar remained, sharp and irrevocable. But so did she. The woman beneath it had not disappeared. Her gaze shifted to the scarf. She lifted it in both hands, and it flowed between her fingers like river water. Cool, soft, kind. There was something deeply personal in its fabric, something preserved in the way it had been folded. She brought it to her head, not to hide the scar, but to shape what others would see, not to cover her story, but to claim it. The scarf settled around her, like it had always known where it belonged. And in the mirror, she saw someone new, still her but steadier, not the hunted girl who would flinch in fear, not the hollowed ghost who'd wandered through snowfall, but a woman who carried every hurt she had survived without letting them define her. Behind her, soft footsteps broke the silence. Boots met floorboard. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. Silas stood in the doorway, one shoulder resting against the frame, silent as ever. His eyes didn't widen, didn't question. Instead, he looked at her with something like reverence. Then, with a nod toward the scarf, he spoke. "That used to be my wife's," he said, voice low but steady. She wore it whenever she needed to feel like herself again. Annabelle's fingers grazed a fabric near her temple. "I thought maybe it would suit you too," he added. She turned slightly, met his gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't lower her eyes. He held her stare with quiet strength, and when he spoke again, his words were soft but grounded, like moss growing over stone. "Anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you've lived through is blind." He paused, letting the truth settle between them. "And the blind don't get to judge beauty." Her throat tightened. The tears came slowly. No rush, no panic. Just a gentle warmth rising from somewhere long buried. She turned back to the mirror, looked again, and this time she reached out, laid her palm flat against the glass, met her reflection halfway. For the first time in a long time, Annabel Crow let herself be seen. Peace, however, does not come untested, not in these woods. It arrived on horseback beneath a bruised sky, a stormlight simmering behind the clouds. The rider was lean, all angles and shadows, his duster torn from long miles and wind. His eyes, sharp and gray, cut through saloon like steel through hide. He didn't drift. He hunted. His name was Cutter, and Cutter had heard whispers on the southern trail. They spoke of a girl with a scar, hiding in the hills, a face once veiled, now seen, a woman with blood on her hands, protected by a lumberman who lived too far from town. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and Cutter listened. Then he rode. By the time he reached the outpost near Northridge, he was asking too many questions. Said he was a traveler looking for timber work. Claimed to be chasing rumors of a man named Boone. Silas met him near the supply shed by chance, but it only took one look. It wasn't the words Cutter used. They were polite, even careful. It was the way he moved, the stillness in his posture, the calculation in his gaze. Silas had seen that stillness before, just before a strike. Later that evening, he returned to the cabin. His face was colder than the wind outside. "He's hunting you," he said. Simple. Final. Annabelle didn't answer. She stood at the stove, stirring soup that had gone thin and gray with memory. Her eyes didn't widen. They simply stared ahead, seeing something far away. Then, without a word, she crossed the room. She knelt at the foot of the cot, reached for the old wooden chest, and opened it.